Imagine someone handed you $100 trillion. Not $100, not 1 million, not even 1 billion. $100 trillion. What would you do? Buy a mansion, a private jet? Maybe retire for the rest of your life? Now imagine taking that same $100 trillion to a grocery store and walking out without enough food for your family. It sounds impossible. But for millions of people in Zimbabwe, that wasn't a thought experiment. It was everyday life. This is the famous Zimbabwe 100 trillion image worth a fortune. But here's the contradiction. When this banknote was finally printed, it couldn't even buy basic everyday necessities. In many cases, it wasn't enough for a loaf of bread. People carried stacks of cash just to buy a few simple items. Workers rushed to spend their wages the moment they were paid, because by the next day, those same wages could buy even less. The biggest banknote in history had become one of the most worthless pieces of money ever created. And that's where the mystery begins. How can a country print the largest banknote the world has ever seen, while its people become poorer every single day? How can a number so unimaginably large end up buying almost nothing? Most people think they already know the answer. They just printed too much money. It's a simple explanation. It sounds logical. Print more money, prices go up. Eventually, the currency becomes worthless. Case closed. At least, that's what I believe too. But the more I looked into Zimbabwe's story, the less that explanation made sense, because it creates another question. If printing money was obviously making everything worse, why didn't they just stop? Why keep printing larger and larger banknotes if everyone could see they were becoming less valuable? That question completely changed how I think about money. Because the famous $100 trillion bill isn't actually where this story begins. It's where the story ends. And to understand how money can become almost worthless, we first have to understand what gives money value in the first place. To understand how money dies, we have to go back to a time when Zimbabwean money was just money. A teacher could finish work on a Friday, collect a paycheck, and know roughly how much food it would buy. A shop owner could restock their shelves without wondering if prices would double before the next delivery arrived. Families could save for birthdays, school fees, or a new appliance because they trusted that the money they set aside today would still have value next month. Life wasn't perfect, but it was predictable, and that's something we often take for granted. Because when money works, nobody thinks about it. You don't wake up wondering whether your salary will still be worth something by dinner. You don't rush to the supermarket the second you're paid. You don't check price tags every few hours, expecting them to change. Money quietly does its job. It's the invisible tool that lets millions of strangers plan for tomorrow. Then, almost unnoticed at first, that certainty began to crack. Not overnight. Not with a single dramatic announcement. Just small changes. Food became a little more expensive. Businesses found it harder to replace the products they sold. Some shelves stayed empty longer than they used to. People started noticing that the same paycheck didn't stretch quite as far as it had a few months earlier. At first, most assumed it was temporary. Prices go up sometimes. Things will settle down. Life will return to normal. But normal never came back. Instead, people slowly changed the way they behaved. Families who once saved their money started spending it more quickly. Shop owners became hesitant to keep the same prices for very long. Businesses found it harder to plan because they no longer knew what things would cost next week. The strange thing was that nothing had completely fallen apart yet. There were no trillion-dollar banknotes, no wheelbarrows overflowing with cash, no headlines about the world's worst inflation, just ordinary people making slightly different decisions than they had before. And when millions of people quietly change their behavior, something much bigger is usually happening beneath the surface. That's the part most people never hear about, because by the time the printing presses were working around the clock, the story had already been unfolding for years. So if printing money wasn't the beginning of Zimbabwe's collapse, what was? The first thing to disappear wasn't the money. It was certainty. Imagine you're a shop owner. A customer walks in and buys the last bag of flour on your shelf. Normally, you'd simply order another one. But this time, you hesitate. Because you have no idea how much that next bag of flour will cost when it arrives. So you raise your prices. Not because you're greedy, because you're afraid. Now imagine you're a teacher. It's payday. Normally, you'd head home, relax, and do your shopping over the weekend. Not anymore. Now you rush straight to the supermarket. Not because you need groceries immediately, but because waiting until tomorrow could mean paying twice as much for the exact same items. Now imagine you're a farmer. The cost of fuel has changed again. Fertilizer is harder to find. Replacement parts for your equipment are becoming more expensive. Growing food becomes riskier. Some farmers produce less. Others stop producing altogether. As food becomes scarcer, prices climb even higher. Now imagine you're running a business. You print a catalog with today's prices. By next week, it's already outdated. You don't know what your next shipment will cost. You don't know what your customers will be willing to pay. You don't even know if accepting cash today will leave you worse off tomorrow. So prices change, again and again and again. One person rushing to spend their salary doesn't seem important. One business changing its prices isn't unusual. One farmer producing less doesn't collapse an economy. But when millions of people begin making the same decisions at the same time, those individual choices start feeding each other. People spend money as quickly as possible. Businesses increase prices because replacing stock is becoming more expensive. Higher prices make people spend even faster. Faster spending pushes prices even higher. The cycle begins feeding itself. Notice something strange. Nobody is being forced to behave this way. Nobody wakes up and says, "Today I'm going to destroy the currency." They're simply trying to protect themselves. Each decision makes perfect sense on its own. But together, they create something no one intended. The government could print more banknotes, but those new banknotes couldn't create more food. They couldn't produce more fuel. They couldn't reopen closed businesses. They couldn't make tomorrow feel predictable again. And that's the clue that changed everything for me. The real crisis wasn't that there was too much money. The real crisis was that people no longer believed today's money would still hold its value tomorrow. The government kept creating more currency. The people kept trying to get rid of it. Those are two completely different things. One side was producing money, the other side was abandoning it. And once that invisible belief began to disappear, money stopped behaving like money. So if money only works because people believe in tomorrow, what happens after tomorrow is no longer believed. By this point, it seems like the solution should have been obvious. If printing more money was making everything worse, why didn't they just stop? It's a question almost everyone asks. And honestly, I asked the same thing. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized something uncomfortable. Stopping wasn't really an option anymore. Think about what a government actually has to do every single month. Teachers expect their salaries. Doctors and nurses expect to be paid. Police officers, firefighters, the military, pensioners. Hospitals need medicine. Schools need supplies. Roads need maintenance. Electricity still has to flow. The government still has bills to pay. But there was one problem. The economy that normally generated the tax revenue to pay for all of that was shrinking. Businesses were closing. Production had fallen. People were earning less, which meant they were paying less in taxes. At the exact moment the government needed money the most, it was collecting less than ever before. Imagine running a household where your income keeps falling, but your bills don't. Your rent is still due. Your children still need food. Your electricity bill doesn't disappear just because you're earning less. Sooner or later, you run out of good choices. Zimbabwe's government found itself in a similar position. It needed money it no longer had, so it turned to the one thing it could still create: more currency. At first, it probably felt like buying time. Pay today's salaries. Deal with tomorrow's problems later. Then tomorrow arrived. Prices had risen again. So even more money had to be printed, which pushed prices even higher, which meant even larger salaries had to be paid, which required even more money. It became a vicious cycle. Not because printing solved the problem, but because every time they stopped, another problem immediately appeared. Hospitals still needed funding. Teachers still expected their wages. The army still had to be paid. The government wasn't printing because it had discovered a path to prosperity. It was printing because it had run out of better options. That doesn't mean the decision was harmless. Far from it. Every new banknote temporarily solved one crisis, while making the next one even worse. It's like trying to put out a house fire with gasoline. For a brief moment you feel like you're doing something, but every attempt makes the flames grow larger. And that's the part I think most people miss. The printing press wasn't leading the collapse, it was chasing it. Every new note was an attempt to catch an economy that was already falling apart, which completely changes the way you see the famous $100 trillion bill. It wasn't the weapon that killed the currency, it was the receipt. A record of every desperate decision that came before it. And if the banknote was only the receipt, then what was the real cause of death? So at what moment does money stop being money? Is it when inflation reaches 100%, 1,000%, 1,000,000%? Or is it when the government prints a $100 trillion banknote? Surprisingly, no. Money dies much earlier than that. It dies the moment people stop wanting to hold it. By the end of Zimbabwe's crisis, something extraordinary had happened. People no longer measured wealth by how many Zimbabwean dollars they owned. They measured it by how quickly they could get rid of them. Payday had become a race against time. Workers collected their salaries and rushed to spend them immediately. Not because they enjoyed shopping, but because waiting until tomorrow meant losing purchasing power. Saving money no longer made sense. Holding cash no longer made sense. Even planning for next week stopped making sense. The Zimbabwean dollar had lost its most important job. It was no longer a store of value. Then people began searching for alternatives. If they could earn or save in foreign currencies, they did. If someone accepted US dollars, those dollars became more desirable than local money. If fuel held its value better than cash, fuel became a better place to store wealth. If bags of maize, cooking oil, or other everyday goods were more reliable, those goods became more valuable than the currency itself. Think about how strange that is. Money exists to make trade easier, but now people preferred almost anything, except the money designed for that purpose. The Zimbabwean dollar hadn't disappeared. The banknotes were still everywhere. In fact, there were more of them than ever before. The government kept creating currency. The people kept abandoning it, and that's when I realized something I'd never thought about before. Money isn't valuable because it's paper. It isn't valuable because a government prints it. It isn't even valuable because a number is written on it. Money is valuable because millions of people believe someone else will still accept it tomorrow. The moment that belief begins to disappear, money starts dying. Not all at once. Quietly. One decision at a time. One purchase at a time. One paycheck at a time. Until one day, the numbers printed on the paper become almost meaningless. That's why the famous $100 trillion note was never the story. It was the tombstone. The currency had already died long before that note was printed. The giant number wasn't the cause. It was the final piece of evidence that the invisible collapse had already happened. And once I understood that, I couldn't stop wondering about something else. If every currency survives because people believe in it, what happens if that belief begins to disappear somewhere else? At the beginning of this story, I thought I was trying to understand one country. Now I realize I was trying to understand something much bigger. Zimbabwe's $100 trillion banknote isn't famous because it's the largest banknote ever printed. It's famous because it reveals something that's usually invisible. Money only works because people believe it will. Every time you hand someone a banknote, you're making an assumption. You're assuming that tomorrow, someone else will accept it from you. That simple belief is what allows billions of strangers to trade with one another every single day. Without it, money is just paper. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this idea doesn't stop with currencies. Every business survives because customers believe it will continue delivering value tomorrow. Every bank survives because depositors believe they can withdraw their money tomorrow. Every stock market depends on investors believing that companies will keep creating value in the future. Even relationships depend on the belief that trust built today will still exist tomorrow. The invisible infrastructure behind all of them is the same: belief, confidence, trust. Zimbabwe simply made that invisible foundation visible. When people stopped believing tomorrow's money would hold its value, everything built on top of that belief began to crack. The banknotes didn't suddenly stop existing. The belief behind them did. And that's the lesson I'll remember long after I've forgotten the exact inflation numbers or the dates of the crisis. The next time I hear about inflation, I won't just ask, how much money are they printing? I'll ask, what happened to trust? The next time I hear about a government spending more than expected, I won't stop at the headlines. I'll ask, what happened to trust? When I hear about a banking crisis, a currency falling, or a market crashing, I'll ask the same question, what happened to trust? Because once you start looking for that invisible force, you begin seeing the world differently. You stop focusing on the symptoms. You start looking for the mechanism underneath them. That's the real story behind Zimbabwe. Not a country that printed too much money, but a country that reminds us what money really is. Money isn't paper. Money isn't ink. Money isn't the number printed in the corner of a banknote. Money is a shared belief about tomorrow. And that's why the world's most famous banknote wasn't a symbol of unimaginable wealth. It was proof that no number of zeros can save a currency once people stop believing in tomorrow.